Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 1944. The trees stood like broken backs against a gray sky. Wind blew through the pine trees with a sound like big guns, and somewhere far away, in the white distance, a single gunshot cracked and went quiet. The cold wasn't just weather. It was like something alive. It moved through jackets and skin and settled in the bones, turning breath into ice and fingers into stiff wood. On a narrow forest road carved between piles of snow taller than a man, an American group walked in a single line. Their boots crunched through snow crust that had frozen, melted, and frozen again. They had been walking for 6 hours. None of them talked. At the front of the line, a sergeant raised his fist. The men stopped. Ahead, half buried in snow and shadows, lay shapes that didn't belong to the forest. They were too straight, too still. The sergeant moved forward alone, his rifle raised, his breath forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. When he reached the first shape, he stopped. Then he knelt down. Then he turned and called back to his men. His voice sounded flat and distant, as if he no longer trusted what he was seeing. The shapes were bodies. German soldiers. 15 of them, maybe more, scattered across a small clearing where the trees opened just enough to let the wind through. They were not killed in fighting. There were no wounds, no blood darkening the snow. They had simply stopped. Some sat with their backs against tree trunks, helmets tilted forward, hands still holding rifles they would never fire again. Others lay curled on their sides, knees pulled to their chests, arms wrapped around themselves in one last try to hold warmth that had already left them. Their uniforms were stiff with frost. Their skin was pale, almost see-through, like wax figures left outside too long. One man's eyes were still open, staring at nothing. His lips were apart, as if he had been trying to say something when the cold took him. The Americans stood in a half-circle around the scene, silent. No one moved to search the bodies. No one talked about gathering information from the enemy or taking their equipment. They simply looked, and by looking, understood something that training had never taught them. The cold didn't care about which side you were on. It didn't care about orders or countries, or the reasons men were sent to kill each other in frozen forests far from home. The cold was total. It was the only enemy that treated all soldiers the same. And in that sameness, it showed a truth that war tried very hard to hide. Under the uniforms and the languages and the beliefs, every man in that forest was made of the same weak flesh, the same fragile warmth, the same desperate need to survive one more night. The sergeant looked at his men. Then he looked at the frozen Germans. Then he made a decision that was not in any rule book, that went against every lesson he had ever received, that went against the very logic of war itself. He took off his pack, pulled out his wool blanket, the only one he had, the only thing standing between him and the same end that had taken these men, and draped it over the nearest German soldier. The body didn't move. The blanket settled over the frozen form like snow. For a moment, no one reacted. Then, one by one, the other Americans did the same. This is the story of what happens when survival stops being a question of winning and becomes a question of seeing each other as human. It's the story of how cold can strip away everything except humanity, and how in the most unlikely situations, enemies become something else entirely. Not friends, not partners, but witnesses to each other's pain, connected by the shared knowledge that death doesn't care who deserves it. It's a story without heroes, without villains, without clear right and wrong. It's simply a story about men who were cold, and men who were colder, and the moment when the difference between them stopped mattering. What the Americans did in that clearing was not mercy. It was not kindness. It was something older and simpler, the understanding that the dead, no matter whose side they died on, deserved to be covered. The act took less than 10 minutes. When it was done, the patrol moved on, lighter without their blankets, heavier with what they had seen. Behind them, 15 German soldiers lay wrapped in American wool, nameless and still, waiting for a spring that would come too late. The winter of 1944 was the coldest Europe had seen in many years, and the Ardennes Forest became a place of death, not by plan, but by weather. When the German attack began on December 16th, it caught the Allies by surprise. Not because the plan was brilliant, but because the weather was terrible. Fog kept airplanes on the ground, snow buried supply lines, temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and soldiers on both sides discovered that the greatest danger was not bullets, but the cold. The human body, when left in freezing cold for too long, begins to shut down in stages. First, the fingers and toes lose feeling as blood moves inward to protect the heart and other important organs. Then comes confusion, as the brain, without enough warmth, begins to work wrong. Speech becomes unclear, vision gets narrow, thoughts slow down and repeat. Finally, the body simply gives up. The heart stops fighting, the lungs go still, and the cold, patient and uncaring, claims another person who once believed they could resist. In the Ardennes, men froze to death in foxholes. They froze while on guard duty. They froze while walking, falling down mid-step and never getting up. The cold killed more men in some groups than enemy fire. American training in 1944 focused on moving fast, hitting hard, and having better equipment than the enemy. Soldiers were trained to move quickly, strike with power, and rely on supply lines that stretched back across the Atlantic Ocean. They were not trained to survive without new supplies. They were not trained to survive frozen warfare in below-zero temperatures with bad clothing and shrinking food supplies. The standard wool coat was made for autumn rain, not freezing wind. The tent could stop rain but not cold. The K-ration gave calories but not warmth. When the German attack broke through American lines and scattered units across frozen forests, thousands of soldiers found themselves cut off, undersupplied, and facing an enemy they had no training for, freezing to death. The body burns through calories to make heat. When food runs out, it burns fat. When fat runs out, it burns muscle. And when muscle runs out, it simply stops. Soldiers who had been healthy and strong at the start of the battle were dead within 48 hours of being cut off from supplies. Not because they were wounded, but because they ran out of fuel. The Germans, strangely, were better prepared, not because their equipment was better, but because they had already learned this lesson fighting in Russia during winter. German soldiers in the Ardennes wore layers taken from 3 winters of fighting in Russia. Fur-lined gloves, wool scarves, newspaper wrapped around their bodies, and straw stuffed inside boots to keep warm. They knew how to build fires that made heat without smoke. They knew how to share body warmth in dugouts, sleeping in turns, pressed together like animals. They knew that surviving in winter was not about being brave, but about being smart. Save energy. Share supplies, keep moving just enough to stay warm, but not enough to sweat. Sweat in below-zero temperatures was a death sentence. It soaked into clothing, froze against the skin, and turned fabric into ice. A soldier who worked too hard died just as surely as one who did nothing at all. The Germans had learned to walk the line between moving and staying still. And for the first weeks of the Ardennes attack, that knowledge kept them alive longer than their enemy. But knowledge only delayed what would happen eventually. By late December, German supply lines were falling apart. Fuel shortages left tanks stuck. Ammunition trucks never arrived. Food became a memory. And the cold, uncaring about strategy and spirit, began to kill Germans as efficiently as it killed Americans. Frostbite took fingers, toes, noses, ears, anything left out too long. Gangrene followed frostbite. Infection followed gangrene. Men who survived combat died days later from wounds that began as numbness. Field hospitals overflowed with cases that had nothing to do with bullets. Trench foot, pneumonia, heart attacks caused by freezing. Doctors cut off blackened limbs with saws made for wood. Pain medicine ran out. Sleep medicine ran out. Men screamed until their voices gave out. And then they died quietly, shivering under thin blankets that did nothing against the cold pressing in from all sides. By January, both armies were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting the winter, and the winter was winning. It was in this situation, exhaustion, cold, and the slow understanding that survival mattered more than victory, that the patrol found the frozen Germans. The Americans had been given a job to do: find enemy positions, figure out their strength, report back. They had been walking for 2 days through forests that looked the same in every direction, sleeping in turns in shallow holes dug in snow, splitting up their food down to a single cracker per day. They were past fear, past anger, past even the basic alertness that kept soldiers alive in combat. They were simply cold and tired, and moving because stopping meant dying. When they found the clearing, their first reaction was not pity or shock. It was relief. Relief that the bodies were German, not American. Relief that someone else had died first. Relief that for the moment they were still alive. But relief is not a feeling that lasts. It falls apart when you look closer. And as the Americans stood over the frozen Germans, looking closer happened without being invited. The sergeant, a man named Harlan, 32 years old, from a town in Pennsylvania so small it didn't appear on most maps, knelt beside the nearest body. The German looked young, 18, maybe 19. His face was smooth, with no wrinkles, still holding the softness of being a teenager under the frost. His hands, folded across his chest, were bare. No gloves, no mittens. His rifle lay beside him, frozen open, with a single bullet still inside. Harlan reached out and touched the boy's shoulder. The fabric was hard as stone. Under it, the body was stiff, locked in place by cold that had turned flesh into a statue. Harlan pulled his hand back, surprised not by death, but by how final it was. He had seen men die before, blown apart, burned, drowned in mud. But those deaths had been violent, sudden, almost unreal in their speed. This was different. This was slow. This was a death you could see coming, that gave you time to know it was happening, that let you feel every stage of your body giving up. Harlan stood and turned to his men. They were watching him, waiting. In their eyes, he saw the same question he was asking himself. What do we do? The rule book said nothing. Training said nothing. The instructions for war didn't include what to do when you find your enemy frozen to death and realize that you are only a few hours, a few degrees, a few bad choices away from the same end. Harlan looked back at the boy. Then he looked at his own blanket, rolled tight and tied to the top of his pack. He had carried that blanket across France. He had slept under it in rain, in mud, in holes that filled with water. It was the only thing he owned that still felt like home. A small wool-wrapped piece of warmth in a world that had none. He hesitated, and then, without fully understanding why, he pulled the blanket free and spread it over the frozen German. One of the other soldiers, a private named Ellis, 19 years old, from Georgia, stepped forward. "Sarge, what are you doing?" Harlan didn't answer right away. He tucked the edges of the blanket around the boy's shoulders, smoothing out the folds as if getting someone ready for sleep. Then he stood. "He's cold," Harlan said. Ellis stared. "He's dead." "Yeah," Harlan said, "but he's still cold." There was a long silence. Then Ellis took off his own pack, pulled out his blanket, and draped it over another body. A third soldier did the same, then a fourth. Within minutes, all 15 frozen Germans were covered. The Americans stood in a circle, their packs lighter, their bodies already feeling the loss of wool. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. What they had done made no sense for fighting. It gave no advantage. It wouldn't shorten the war or save a single life. It was, by every measure that mattered to the armies they served. Pointless. And yet, in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense at all. The patrol moved on, and behind them, the forest swallowed the clearing, uncaring and silent. But the act, small, brief, and seen by no one except the men who did it, didn't disappear. It stayed with them. It followed them through the rest of the campaign, through the push into Germany, through the end of the war, and the long years after. Some of the men never spoke about it. Others told the story once to a wife or a child, and then never again. But all of them remembered. They remembered the cold. They remembered the bodies. And they remembered the moment when they stopped seeing uniforms and started seeing something else. Boys who had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Boys who had died alone, far from home, wrapped in nothing but frost and silence. Boys who, in the end, were no different from them. The question that stayed with them, though none of them ever said it out loud, was simple. Why did we do it? Not why did they cover the bodies. That part was instinct, almost automatic once Harlan made the first move. The real question was deeper. Why did it feel necessary? These were enemy soldiers, men who hours or days earlier might have shot them on sight, men whose deaths should have been a relief, a point scored in favor of survival. And yet, standing over those frozen forms, the Americans had felt no relief. They had felt something closer to recognition, a recognition that the cold was the real enemy, that the war, for all its noise and fury, came second to the basic struggle of staying alive in a world that wanted them dead, and that in the face of that struggle, the labels of enemy and ally became meaningless. This recognition, unspoken, uncomfortable, impossible to match with the mission they had been trained for, was the true puzzle of the Ardennes winter. War depends on taking away someone's humanity. It depends on being able to see the enemy as completely different, completely other, completely less deserving of life. But the cold didn't allow for that. The cold revealed the body in all its weakness, the skin that blistered, the fingers that turned black, the heart that stuttered and stopped. The cold made it impossible to pretend that the enemy was anything other than human, because being human was the only reason the cold could kill them. And once that understanding happened, once the Americans saw their own death reflected in the frozen Germans, the entire logic of war began to break down. Not forever, not completely, but enough to create a moment, a single quiet moment, when covering the dead felt more important than counting them. The bodies stayed in the clearing through the winter, hidden under snow and American wool. When the spring thaw came in March 1945, soldiers whose job was to collect the dead found them. The report written by the recovery team noted the blankets with confusion. 15 German soldiers, killed in action, cause of death, freezing, all covered with U.S. Army-issued wool blankets. Where blankets came from, unknown. The blankets were gathered, washed, and given out again. The bodies were buried in a temporary cemetery outside Bastogne, marked with wooden crosses that listed rank, unit, and a single word, unbekannt, unknown. The men who had covered them were by then 300 miles east, pushing through the Rhineland, too busy with survival to think about what they had left behind. But the story, like all true stories, didn't need the people in it to survive. It survived on its own, passed along in pieces, reshaped by memory and distance until it became something larger than the act itself. Some versions of the story say the Americans covered the Germans because they believed in honoring the dead, no matter what country they were from. Other versions say it was practical, the blankets were extra weight, and leaving them behind made sense for fighting. Still others claim it was guilt, a hidden need to make up for the killing the war demanded. All of these explanations have truth in them, and all of them miss the point. The Americans covered the Germans because in that moment, it was the only human thing to do. Not kind, not noble, not heroic, just human. The act said that the dead had once been alive, that their lives had mattered to someone, and that their deaths, however expected, however unremarkable in the math of war, deserved to be noticed. The blankets were not a message. They were not a protest. They were simply saying, "You were here. You were cold. You are cold still." The winter of 1944 killed tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides of the Ardennes. Most of them died in combat, but thousands died the way the 15 Germans died, slowly, quietly, alone. They froze in foxholes, in trenches, in forests. They froze while waiting for supply drops that never came, while marching toward goals that stopped existing, while standing guard over positions that no longer mattered. Their bodies were found weeks later, sometimes months later, scattered across the land like thrown-away equipment. Most were buried without ceremony. Many were never identified. A few, a very few, were covered by someone who took the time to notice their death, even if that cost them something they needed to survive. Those acts, rare and unrecorded, show something important about war that official histories never capture. The moments when soldiers stopped being soldiers and became human beings again, if only for a few minutes, if only in the presence of the dead. By February 1945, the German attack had failed, and the front moved east, leaving the Ardennes behind. The Americans who had covered the frozen Germans went on to fight in other battles, in other forests, in other winters that were not quite as cold, but just as hard. Harlan survived the war. Ellis did not. He died in April, 2 weeks before the surrender, shot by a sniper while crossing a river in Bavaria. The others scattered after being sent home, returning to lives that had continued without them, to families who didn't ask questions, to jobs and routines that felt strange and small after years of living at the edge of death. Harlan never spoke about the frozen Germans until 1983, when a historian interviewing veterans about the Battle of the Bulge asked if he remembered anything unusual. Harlan paused. Then he told the story slowly, carefully, as if testing each word before saying it. When he finished, the historian asked why he thought the patrol had done it. Harlan sat quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because we were cold, too." That answer, simple, not quite enough, deeply true, captures the heart of what happened in that clearing. The Americans didn't cover the Germans because of beliefs or right and wrong or any idea they learned in school. They did it because they understood, in a way that no amount of training could teach, what it meant to be cold. They understood that cold was not discomfort or bother. It was erasure. It was the body's slow betrayal, the gradual shutdown of everything that made life possible. They understood that the 15 Germans had died fighting that erasure, just as they themselves were fighting it, and that the only difference between the living and the dead was time and luck. And so they covered them, not to make a statement, not to prove anything, but because in that moment, covering them was the same as covering themselves. A small, useless, necessary act of fighting back against a world that wanted them all dead. The legacy of that act is invisible. There is no monument, no sign, no official record beyond a single line in a report about collecting the dead. The men who did it are gone. The men they covered are gone. Even the forest has changed. The trees that stood as witnesses were cut down decades ago, replanted, cut down again. But the act itself remains, built into the few stories that survived, passed down not as history, but as memory. It remains because it speaks to something basic about war. Not the big plans or the turning points or the moments of bravery that fill textbooks, but the small, quiet moments when soldiers recognized that their enemy was not the man in the other uniform, but the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, the fear, the slow grind of survival that wore them all down equally. In those moments, the war revealed itself as it truly was, not a contest between nations, but a contest between human beings and the forces, both natural and man-made, that tried to destroy them. The 15 frozen Germans were not victims of beliefs. They were not martyrs. They were not heroes. They were simply men who ran out of time, whose bodies gave up to the cold before the war could decide what would happen to them. And the Americans who covered them were not saviors. They were not angels of mercy. They were simply men who, for reasons they couldn't fully explain, decided that the dead deserved more than frost. That decision cost them warmth they couldn't spare, in a winter that killed without caring, in a war that demanded they see their enemy as less than human. And yet, they made it anyway. Not because it was right, but because it was necessary. Not because it changed anything, but because not doing it would have changed. Them, 60 men froze to death within 5 miles of that. Clearing over the course of the winter, Americans and Germans scattered across the forest in groups of 2 or 3 or 5, their bodies forming small monuments to the cold's power. Most were found in spring. Some were never found at all, their remains absorbed into the soil, their names added to the long lists of the missing. The war moved on without them. The front shifted, the snow melted, the trees bloomed, and the living, who had survived by luck or by will, or by the simple fact of being in the right place when the wind shifted, returned home and tried to forget. But memory, like cold, has a way of settling deep. The men who covered the frozen Germans carried that memory for the rest of their lives, whether they spoke of it or not. It shaped how they thought about the war. It shaped how they thought about the enemy, and it shaped how they thought about themselves. In the end, the story of the frozen Germans is not about compassion, or right and wrong, or the better parts of human nature. It's about recognition. The recognition that war, for all its complexity and show and reasons, comes down to this: bodies in the cold, fighting to stay warm. Everything else, the flags, the orders, the reasons, the hatreds, falls away in the face of that basic struggle. And in that moment of recognition, when the living stand over the dead and see not enemies, but reflections, the war stops making sense. Not forever, not even for long, but for a moment, it stops. And in that moment, covering the dead becomes not an act of kindness, but an act of fighting back. A refusal to let the cold have the final word. A refusal to let death be nameless. A refusal to accept that the war decides who deserves to be remembered. The blanket said, "You were human. You mattered. Someone saw." 70 years later, in a village outside Bastogne, a farmer plowing a field found a scrap of wool buried 18 inches beneath the surface. It was rotted, barely recognizable, but the weave was clear. U.S. Army issue, 1940s pattern. He brought it to a local museum, which added it to a collection of items from the Battle of the Bulge: helmets, shell casings, canteens, dog tags. The wool was labeled "Origin Unknown," found near site of German casualties. Possible grave marker. No one who saw it knew the story. No one who saw it could have guessed that it represented not a grave marker, but a moment. A moment when soldiers chose to carry less, so the dead could be covered more. The story was gone. The witnesses were gone. The forest was gone. But the wool remained. A piece of something larger, something that couldn't be fully explained or understood, something that fought against the easy stories war tries to tell. It remained because acts like the one it represented don't fit into history. They're too small, too personal, too unclear. And yet, they're the only acts that show what war actually does to the people who fight it. War doesn't make people better. It doesn't make things clear. It doesn't make men better or worse. It simply makes them cold and tired, and desperate, and sometimes, very sometimes, human in ways they can't afford to be. The men who covered the frozen Germans were not heroes. They were survivors who, for reasons even they didn't fully understand, paused in their own survival to notice someone else's death. That noticing didn't save anyone. It didn't change the outcome of the battle. It didn't shorten the war. But it changed them. It marked them. And decades later, when they told the story, if they told it at all, they spoke not about bravery or sacrifice, but about a simple, undeniable truth. That in the coldest winter they had ever known, the only warmth left was the warmth they chose to give away. And that choice, however small, however forgotten, was the only thing that mattered.